The briefing that changed everything lasted 28 seconds. I know because I timed the recording years later, playing it back on a cheap recorder I was never supposed to have running, listening to a man cross a piece of forest off my life in the time it takes to tie a boot. His name was Delaney. Ivar Delaney, District Patrol Supervisor for the Umbra Cascade National Forest, 31 years in the service, the kind of man who could read weather off the underside of clouds and tell you which drainage a lost hiker had gone down by the smell of the wind. That morning in April of 2006, he handed out assignments the way he always did, standing at the laminated master patrol grid in the muster room at the Weatherly District Station, tapping sectors with the capped end of a dry erase marker. He got to me last. I was newer to the district then, though not to the works. 6 years already in 3 other forests, transferred in because Umbra Cascade had a reputation for taking patrols seriously, and I wanted to learn from people who did. Delaney looked at the roster, looked at the grid, and said, "Corcoran, you've got the Menic drainage this rotation, K17. He said it, and then something crossed his face. Not alarm, nothing so dramatic. It was the small correction of a man who has said a wrong word in a foreign language and heard it land. He uncapped the marker. On the master grid, the big one, the one every ranger in the district read a dozen times a day. He drew a single clean line through the sector labeled K17, up in the northeast quadrant, where the Menic drainage folded back on itself under Hollent Ridge. Then he wrote a different sector number beside my name. J9. Lower elevation, easier ground, nowhere near the drainage he'd just named. "You've got J9, he said. "Trailhead inspections and the collar check on the Averill herd." I remember I started to ask. It was reflexive the assignment had changed mid-sentence, and I wanted to know why, the way you'd want to know why a pilot turned the plane around. Delaney capped the marker before I got the first word out. He wasn't unfriendly about it. He had a way of shutting a door that made you feel he was doing you a kindness. "You'll understand why nobody goes there after your first season," he said. That was all. He moved on to the maintenance assignments, the culvert clearing below Sturgis Meadow, the sign replacement on the Loop 9 trailhead, and the room absorbed the moment the way a still pond absorbs a dropped stone, closing over it, going flat again. Nobody looked at me. Nobody looked at the line through K17. It was as if the correction was so ordinary that acknowledging it would have been the strange thing. I want to be precise about what I noticed and what I didn't, because the whole of what follows depends on it. I did not notice that morning that Delaney's line through K17 fell exactly where 100 other lines had fallen before it. I did not notice that the master grid, which was reprinted and relaminated every 2 years, had a faint gray shadow of ink through that same sector, the ghost of previous corrections, sanded down by cleaning but never fully gone. I did not notice that when the maintenance assignments were read out, the culverts and the signs and the trail repairs all clustered along the edges of K17 like iron filings around a magnet, and never once inside it. I noticed none of that. I took my J9 assignment, drove out to the Averill herd, spent a clean spring day checking radio collars on elk and photographing a washed-out section of the Loop 9 trail, and thought no more about the 28 seconds in the muster room than I thought about the weather, which was fine. It took me most of a year to notice the pattern, and once I noticed it, I could not stop noticing it. And that is really where this account begins. The Umbra Cascade covers a little over 900,000 acres of the eastern Cascades, and the district I worked, Weatherly, held the roughest quarter of it. We ran patrol on a rotating grid system that everyone just called the board. Every sector got a visit on a schedule keyed to season, fire risk, wildlife activity, and trail traffic. The whole philosophy of the board was coverage. You did not leave holes. A hole in coverage was how a lost hiker became a body, how a lightning strike became a burn scar, how a poacher became a habit. Delaney used to say the board didn't forgive gaps, and he meant it as praise for a system that didn't. So the first thing that snagged me, sometime that following winter, was that K-17 was a gap. I found it the way you find anything in this work, by doing the paperwork. I'd been assigned to reconcile the previous year's patrol logs against the coverage requirements, a tedious annual audit that the district ran to prove to the regional office that every acre had gotten its scheduled eyes. It was the kind of task they gave to someone reliable and slightly overqualified, which by then I was. I sat in the file room at Weatherly with a year of patrol reports and the coverage matrix and started checking boxes. Every sector checked out. Every sector but one. K-17 showed as covered. That was the strange part. It wasn't blank. The matrix showed patrols logged, hours recorded, rangers assigned. But when I pulled the actual reports to verify the daily patrol narratives, the GPS track files, the vehicle mileage logs, the coverage evaporated. A patrol logged for K-17 on a Tuesday in July had a GPS track that ran entirely through J-11, 2 sectors south. A wildlife survey filed for the Mennick drainage had photographs geotagged to the Averill Meadows. The mileage on a vehicle assigned to K-17 matched to the 10th, a round trip to the Sturgis culverts and back. Every single patrol assigned to K-17 that year had actually happened somewhere else. Not sloppily. That was what unsettled me, even then, before I understood anything. Sloppy would have been reassuring. Sloppy would have meant tired rangers cutting corners, logging a sector they'd glanced at from the road. This was the opposite of sloppy. Every misplaced patrol was fully, competently documented. The rangers had done real work, real trail inspections, real collar checks, real fire observations, just never in the sector they'd been assigned. The assignment said K-17. The evidence said everywhere but. I did what any auditor does with an anomaly. I assumed it was mine. I repulled the files. I checked the sector boundaries on the GIS system in case K-17 had been redrawn, and I was reading old coordinates against new maps. I checked whether K-17 was one of those administrative sectors that exists only on paper, a numbering artifact with no ground under it. It wasn't. K-17 was 14,000 acres of real forest, healthy timber, and maintained trail, and a drainage full of water, sitting in the northeast quadrant exactly where Delaney's marker had crossed it out. I flagged it in my audit. I wrote a clean, neutral note. Sector K-17 shows assigned patrols with location data inconsistent with sector boundaries. Recommend review. I submitted the audit up the chain and went back to work. And I want to be honest about my state of mind then, because it matters. I was not frightened. I was mildly pleased with myself. I thought I had caught a real logistical error, the kind that made audits worth doing, and I expected some administrative correction to come down a memo about GPS calibration maybe, or a retraining note about assignment codes. The audit came back to me 8 days later. My flag was gone. Not overruled, not answered, gone. In its place, in the review field, someone had entered a single line in a flat administrative phrasing I had never seen before and would come to know very well. Route corrected. No further review required. There was no reviewer name attached. The system logged every entry with a user ID. This one had none. I asked the district clerk, a patient woman named Fenna Pruitt, who had run the Weatherly files for 2 decades, who had closed my flag. She looked at the entry for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice with all the color drained out of it, "That's the standing notation. That one closes itself." And she went back to her filing, and I understood that I had just been told something and that I was not going to be told any more. I let it go for a while. I want that on the record, too, because later I judged myself hard for how long I let things go. And it isn't fair. A working ranger does not have infinite time to chase a filing anomaly. Fire season came. We had a bad lightning bust in August that put 400 acres up in the cold water unit, and I spent 3 weeks on the line, and after that, a hunter went missing in the Sturgis high country, and I spent 9 days on the search, and we found him alive, which does not always happen, and that autumn I did not think about K-17 at all. But something had been set down in me and would not be picked back up. Delaney's sentence had lodged. You'll understand why nobody goes there after your first season. I had done 2 seasons by then, and I did not understand, and the not understanding had started to itch. So that winter, I went looking, quietly. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself a lot of things. I started with the maps, because maps are where I'm most at home. The GIS system held the current sector boundaries, but the district archive at Weatherly held the paper maps going back to the forest's establishment, the old survey sheets and patrol grids, some of them beautiful hand-inked things from the days when a ranger's whole job description could fit on an index card. I pulled the historical patrol grids for the northeast quadrant, one for roughly every decade, and I laid them out on the long table in the archive room, in order, oldest to newest, and I looked at K-17 across 70 years. It changed shape. I don't mean it was redrawn, the way sectors sometimes are when a trail is rerouted or a boundary follows a new road. I mean the sector labeled K-17, always K-17. The number never changed, occupied a different piece of ground on nearly every map. On the 1954 grid, it sat high against Holant Ridge, a long, narrow sector following the ridge line. On the 1963 grid, it had slid down into the drainage, wider, rounder, the ridge portion, given to a neighboring sector. By 1978, it had crossed the Mennick Creek entirely and sat on the eastern bench. On the 1991 grid, it was back against the ridge but rotated, as if someone had taken the 1954 sector and turned it 40 degrees. The current boundary, the one I patrolled around, matched none of them. Every other sector in the quadrant was stable. J9, J11, the cold water units, you could stack their outlines across 70 years, and they'd nest inside each other with the small, tidy variations of ordinary boundary revision. Only K17 wandered, and on every map, in the margin, in different hands and different inks across the decades, was some version of the same notation. On the 1954 sheet, in fountain pen, sector under continued observation, see continuity file. On the 1978 sheet, in ballpoint, K-17, continuity do not reassign without CO clearance. On the 1991 sheet, typed on a pasted label, refer all K-17 discrepancies to Continuity Office. The Continuity Office. I had worked in that district for 2.5 years, and I had never heard those two words together. There was no Continuity Office in the org chart. There was no Continuity Office on the building directory. There was no Continuity Office anywhere in the training I'd received, the manuals I'd read, the chain of command I reported through. And yet here it was, referenced by name on official maps across 5 decades, in the confident shorthand of people who plainly assumed the reader would know exactly what it was. I want to describe what that did to me, because it's the hinge of the whole thing. Up to that point, I had been chasing what I believed was an error, a big, strange, persistent error. But an error. The kind of institutional glitch that hides in any organization old enough and large enough. An error can be corrected. An error is comforting because it implies the system is basically sound and something merely slipped. But an error does not have an office. An error does not get a file. The moment I read refer all K17 discrepancies to Continuity Office, I understood that what I'd found was not a failure of the system. It was a function of the system. Someone had built machinery to handle this, and had been running that machinery, quietly, competently, for longer than I'd been alive. I photographed all the maps. I did it after hours, with my own camera, and I did not tell myself why I felt the need to do it privately, though I knew. The next thing I found was the notebooks. The district kept archived field notebooks. The personal patrol logs rangers carried in their breast pockets, turned in at retirement or reassignment, boxed and shelved and mostly forgotten. Nobody read them. They had no official standing. The official record was the typed patrol report. But rangers wrote things in their field notebooks they'd never put in a report. And I'd learned early that if you wanted to know what a piece of country was really like, you read the notebooks of the people who'd walked it. I pulled every archived notebook I could find that covered the northeast quadrant. It took weeks, spread across winter evenings, because they weren't organized by sector, only by ranger and year. But I found what I was half afraid I'd find, and then I found something worse. A ranger named Prosper Halt patrolling the Mennick drainage in the summer of 1961, wrote this. Walked K-17 the full length. Good timber, creek running strong. Odd thing, came out at the Averill Gate and my watch said I'd been in 3 hours, but the light was wrong for it, more like 6. Boots dry, no memory of the creek crossing, and I'd have had to cross to reach the gate. Filing normal. A ranger named Idoni Kesh, patrolling the same drainage in the summer of 1989. 28 years later, a woman who could not possibly have read Halt's private notebook, which had been boxed in the archive for a quarter-century, wrote this. Full-length walk of K-17. Timber healthy, creek up. Strange 3 hours by the watch, but the light said closer to 6. Came out at the Averill Gate with dry boots. Can't recall the crossing, and I'd have had to cross to get there, reporting it as a normal patrol. I sat in the archive with those 2 notebooks open side by side, 28 years and 2 strangers between them, and read the same observation, twice in almost the same words, and the back of my neck went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the unheated room. It wasn't only those 2. Once I knew what I was looking for, the pattern surfaced everywhere. Not in every notebook. Most rangers, like me in my first years, patrolled around K-17 without ever setting foot in it, and never knew. But the ones who did enter it, across 70 years, came out writing variations of the same 3 or 4 observations. The light that didn't match the elapsed time. The dry boots, after a crossing they couldn't remember. And again in hands from the 50s to the 90s, a particular unease that none of them could name, and all of them described the same way. A sense, walking back out, that the forest behind them was not quite the forest they had walked into. One ranger in 1972 put it more plainly than the rest. He wrote, "Everything was where it should be." That was the problem. It was too exactly where it should be, like a room somebody cleaned to look untouched. I closed the notebooks. I had by then a decision to make, and I knew it, and I made the wrong one, or the only one, depending on how you count. I decided to walk K-17 myself. I told nobody. That was deliberate, and it was against everything my training and my instincts said. You do not patrol the backcountry alone without filing a plan. It is the first rule, the rule under all the other rules, the one that keeps rangers alive. But I understood by then that if I filed a plan for K-17, the plan would be quietly corrected before I ever left the truck. My assignment would swap. My route would adjust. The machinery Delaney had shown me in 28 seconds would do to me what it had done to everyone, and I would end up in J9 checking collars and wondering why. So I did the thing I had spent 15 years telling younger rangers never to do. I filed a patrol plan for J11, the sector just south, and I drove to the Averill Gate on a clear morning in early June, and I walked north into K-17 alone, with a full pack, a fresh battery in my body camera, a handheld GPS logging a track every 10 seconds, and my personal camera loaded with film, because film cannot be quietly rewritten by a database. I need to tell you what I found in there, and the honest answer is nothing. Nothing at all. That is the whole horror of it. and I don't know how to make it land the way it landed on me, standing in it. The forest was beautiful. It was, if anything, in better condition than the sectors around it. The timber was old-growth Douglas fir and mountain hemlock, healthy, no beetle kill, no blowdown clogging the drainages. The trail, and there was a trail, a good one, cut and graded and drained the way trails are when someone maintains them, ran clean and true up the Mennick Creek. I saw a black bear and 2 cubs at 400 yards. I saw elk sign, fresh. I heard a pileated woodpecker, and once high up, the descending cry of a goshawk. The creek ran strong and cold, and I filled a bottle from it and drank, and it was the best water I'd had in that forest. My radio worked. I keyed the repeater and got a clean signal and heard the ordinary chatter of an ordinary day. Another ranger reporting a downed sign at Loop 9. Dispatch acknowledging. The small liturgy of the work going on around me exactly as it should. I walked the full length of the sector. I crossed the creek. I made a point of it. I stood in the water to my knees and photographed my own wet boots on film with the date card in frame, because I had read about the dry boots, and I was not going to be one of those entries. I reached the Averill Gate at the north end in the late afternoon. I checked my watch. I had been in K-17 for 6 hours and 40 minutes. The light was exactly right for it. My boots were soaked. My GPS showed a clean track up the drainage and out the gate. I felt, standing there, an enormous and slightly foolish relief. The relief of a man who has finally looked under the bed and found no monster. I remember thinking, almost cheerfully, that I would write it all up, that I would take my film and my track and my footage to Delaney and say gently that whatever this had been, it had stopped, that the forest was just a forest now, and the machinery could be quietly retired. I drove back to the station. I plugged the GPS into the reconciliation software to download my track, and the whole floor of the thing I understood dropped out from under me. The GPS track did not show K-17. It showed a full patrol of J-11, the sector I'd filed for, the sector I had not set foot in, a clean loop through the southern trailheads, mileage matching, timestamps matching, every 10-second point, falling neatly along trails I had not walked. The download was not corrupted. It was not blank. It was a complete, coherent, competent record of a day I had not lived. I sat there, and I felt the specific vertigo of a man watching a machine tell him a lie so total and so calm that it made his own memory feel like the malfunction. I pulled the body camera footage. 6 hours and 40 minutes of recording. The first 11 minutes showed the Averill Gate and the start of the trail up the drainage, exactly as I remembered. Then a gap. Not static, not a glitch, a clean cut, one frame to the next, and on the far side of it, the footage showed the J-11 trailheads in afternoon light. My own gloved hands photographing a downed sign at Loop 9, a sign I had never seen that day. 6.5 hours of footage of a patrol I had not performed, bracketed at the front by 11 true minutes. The system had not bothered to erase my film. When I developed it myself 2 days later, in a friend's dark room, rather than trust it to anyone, showed K-17. All of it. The old-growth timber, the bear, and her cubs, my own soaked boots on the creek stones with the date card, June K-17, in my handwriting. 36 frames of a place the entire electronic record of the United States Forest Service insisted I had never entered. That was the night I stopped believing K-17 was a place with a problem, and started understanding it was a problem wearing a place. I need to be careful here, because this is where I could lose you, and where I nearly lost myself. The obvious reading is that I was unwell, that I'd walked J11 in some fugue, confabulated the drainage, staged the film. I considered it seriously. I'm not a man who trusts his own certainty over the evidence, and here the evidence was split against itself. The digital record on one side, and the film and my body on the other. But there was a third witness, and the third witness broke the tie. My boots. The leather was soaked through and stained with the particular rust-red silt of the upper mennick, a mineral color that does not occur anywhere in J11, which drains a different geology entirely. I mailed a scraping of it, without explanation, to a soils lab I'd worked with on a contamination case years before. It came back upper mennick and acidic clay, a match to samples the Forest Service itself had on file for K-17. My body had been in that drainage. Everything electronic said it hadn't. The film and the mud were the only two things in the whole apparatus that could not be quietly corrected, and they agreed with each other and with me. I understood then that whatever this was, it did not touch the world evenly. It could rewrite a database, edit a video file, generate a false GPS track. It was fluent, effortlessly fluent, in the language of records. But it could not reach into a canister of exposed film in my dark room, or the silt worked into my boot leather. It corrected the institution's memory of the forest. It did not correct the forest, and it did not quite correct me. I took the film, the boots, the soil report, and a written account to Delaney. I did it in his office with the door shut. I had rehearsed how I'd say it so it wouldn't sound like a man coming apart, and I think I managed. He listened without interrupting. He looked at the film, frame by frame, on a loop. He read the soil report twice. He did not look surprised, and that was the worst part, that a man I respected more than almost anyone could look at proof that the world was broken in a specific and documented way, and show me only the tired recognition of someone hearing news he'd been waiting years to hear. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked me one question. He asked whether the trail up the drainage had been maintained. I said yes. Graded, drained, brushed out, recently. He nodded slowly, and he said, "We stopped assigning maintenance to K-17 in 1994. And then he said the thing I have carried for 20 years. He said, "Somebody's still keeping the trail up. It just isn't us anymore. It stopped being us a long time ago, and the country hasn't noticed, and that's the mercy of it, and you've just gone and made yourself somebody it might notice." He would not explain that. He told me to go home. He told me, not unkindly, to think very hard about what I wanted from the rest of my life. And he told me that the continuity office would likely reach out to me, and that when it did, the smartest and safest thing I could do was let it correct my file and forget I had ever downloaded that track. Then he said one more thing, and he said it looking at the wall, not at me. He said, "I walked it in 81. I know what you saw, and I know what you're going to start remembering. And I'm sorry, because there's no stopping that part now." I asked him what he meant. What was I going to start remembering? He said, "A different forest. Give it a season." I did not let it go. I want to be truthful about my own stubbornness. A wiser man, a man Delaney was clearly hoping I might be, would have taken the warning and let the file be corrected and gone back to the ordinary sacred work of keeping people alive in the mountains. I could not. I had seen the machinery now, and I had to know who ran it. The continuity office was not on any org chart, but offices leave residue. Budgets, mail, keys, phone extensions. No institution can run something for 70 years without leaving a trail through its own plumbing. And the plumbing of the Forest Service was something I understood. I found it the way I'd found everything, through the paperwork. There was a cost center in the district budget, a 5-digit code that recurred every fiscal year going back to the earliest digitized records, labeled only Regional Continuity Support, Umbra. It carried a small, stable annual allocation, never audited, never questioned, the kind of line item that survives every reorganization, because no one alive remembers what it's for, and everyone assumes someone else does. It paid for a post office box in the town of Holland, at the base of the ridge. And it paid, 4 times a year, a modest sum to a contractor listed only as M.T. Vesey, trail maintenance. Somebody was still keeping the trail up. It just isn't us anymore. I drove to Holland. It is barely a town, a gas station and a feed store and a scatter of houses under the ridge, the kind of place that exists because a road happened to pass through it. The post office was a single room. I asked the clerk, an old man who'd clearly held the job forever, about box 41, the continuity box. He said it had been rented continuously since before he started, that the rent came in every year like clockwork, cash in an envelope, and that in all his decades he had seen it emptied exactly 4 times a year, on the same weeks, by the same person, though he could not for the life of him describe her when I pressed him. He tried. He got as far as a woman, older, quiet, and then his face did the thing the map margins did, the thing my GPS did. It produced a clean, confident, empty record. "She comes regular," he said, "real regular. I couldn't tell you the last time, though. Couldn't tell you what she drives." He was not lying. He simply had a correction where the memory should have been. I found M.T. Vesey the way you find anyone in a small county, through the assessor's records, the tax rolls, the small physical archive of a rural life. There had been a Marta Vesey who lived up the Holland Road, a Forest Service trail crew foreman who had retired in 1983, and according to the county, died in 1994, the year they stopped assigning maintenance to K-17. The year, according to the district budget, the Vesey maintenance contract began. I sat with that for a long time. A woman who died in 1994 had been paid 4 times a year for the 12 years since to maintain a trail in a sector no ranger had officially entered in that entire span. The trail I had walked, the trail that was graded and drained and recently brushed out. I did not have an explanation for it then, and I do not have one now. I only had the trail, which was real, and the mud on my boots, which was real, and a dead woman's name on a live contract, and the slow understanding that the continuity office was not covering up an anomaly. It was employing it. It had made an arrangement. I found the office itself in the end, or what was left of it. It was not in Holland. It was in the district station where I had worked every day for years. Behind a door in the archive basement I had walked past 1,000 times, marked only records inactive, that I had never had reason to open because inactive records are the definition of what you don't need. The key was on the master ring, unlabeled, the one key nobody ever used. Fenna Pruitt watched me take the ring. She did not stop me. She said only, "There's nobody down there." And then after a moment, in a smaller voice, "There hasn't been anybody down there for a long time. It runs itself now." And I understood that she knew, that she had always known, that the flat, colorless voice she'd used the day she told me the standing notation closed itself was the voice of a woman who had made her own arrangement decades ago and kept it. The room was small and dry and full of the anomaly's whole life. 70 years of it. Filing cabinets of correction notices, each one a small tragedy filed flat, a ranger's flag, a discrepancy, and clipped to it the standing notation in a hand that never varied across the decades, route corrected, no further review required, the same pen pressure, the same slight backward slant, filed by someone who had apparently been closing these flags since 1953, and had never once aged into a different handwriting. There were the wildlife collars, a whole drawer of them, tracking collars from elk, and one from a wolf. Each one logged as failed at a boundary, the last GPS ping in every case, falling on the same invisible line, no matter where K-17 had wandered to that decade, as if the sector had an edge that stayed put, even when the sector didn't. There were photographs, hundreds of them, aerial and ground, of a drainage that looked in all of them exactly as I had seen it, healthy and maintained and calm, dated across 70 years, unchanging, a forest that did not grow or burn or age like the forest around it. And there was a logbook, the master log, and it was in it that I found the last thing, the thing that finally stopped me, that turned me from a man investigating a place into a man who simply went home. The logbook recorded every ranger who had ever entered K-17 and come back out. There were 58 of them across 70 years. Each entry gave a name, a date, and a single notation about what the ranger had begun to report in the seasons after their entry. The notation was the same for all 58. It read, "Subject began describing an alternate route configuration consistent with prior subjects. Continuity maintained." I understood it then, all at once, the way you understand a drop when your foot is already off the edge. The sector was not avoided because something in it could hurt you. Prosper Holt walked out unharmed. Ida Nikesh walked out unharmed. I walked out unharmed. What happened to all of us happened afterward, slowly, in the mind and in the record. We began, each of us, in the seasons after, to remember a slightly different forest, a trail that ran a little differently, a creek that crossed a little differently, a sector shaped a little differently than the maps said. And because rangers write down what they remember, our altered memories flowed into our notebooks, and the notebooks agreed with each other across decades, not because we copied one another, but because the thing was moving all of us, gently, toward the same remembered map. The continuity office existed to catch the discrepancies while they were still small, to file the corrections, to keep the institution's official memory pinned to reality, even as the forest quietly rewrote the memory of every person who entered it. It was not hiding a danger. It was holding a line, the same invisible line the callers died on, between the forest as it was and the forest as 58 rangers had slowly, helplessly begun to agree it should be. I found my own name in the logbook. My entry was dated 3 days after my walk, before I had told anyone but Delaney. The notation was already there, in that same unaging hand. Subject began describing an alternate route configuration consistent with prior subjects, continuity maintained. I had not begun describing anything. Not yet. The log had recorded it before I did it, and that is when I stopped, because I understood that I could not win a fight against a record that was written ahead of me, and because I was afraid, for the first time cleanly, and simply afraid, of finding out what else it already knew I was going to do. I left the ring on Fenna's desk. I did not tell Delaney what I'd found. He already knew. He had known since 1981, and the mercy he'd spoken of was the mercy of not making him say it. I finished that season, and I transferred out of Weatherly that winter, and I left the Forest Service entirely 2 years after that, and I told myself, the way we all did, that it was for ordinary reasons. Delaney was right about the last part. I did begin to remember a different forest. It came the way he said it would, over a season, so gently I could not point to the day it happened. When I think now of the Mennick drainage, and I try not to, the creek crosses the trail lower than it did in my photographs. The trail runs along the east bench, not the west. There is a stand of larch near the Averill gate that I can see clearly, gold in October, that does not appear in any of my 36 frames of film. I have looked. It is not there. But I remember it, and the remembering is warmer and more certain than the film, and every year it wins a little more. That is why I kept the film, and the boots, and the soil report in a box I do not open. They are the only witnesses left that agree with the man I was, and I am no longer entirely that man, and I did not want to be alone in a room with the evidence and my own memory, and have to find out which one I'd believe. I would have left it there. I had made my peace. The small, tired peace of a man who accepts he has touched something he cannot understand and chooses to stop touching it. Then, 2 months ago, a former colleague from Weatherly, one of the young ones I'd trained, now senior herself, now the one crossing sectors off the board for the new arrivals, sent me the current district GIS database. She sent it without comment, which was itself the comment. She and I had never once spoken of K-17. We had not needed to. There is no K-17 in it anymore. The sector has been retired. its number gone from the grid the way a number goes when the thing under it no longer needs watching. In its place in the northwest quadrant, now the opposite corner of the forest from where the Menick drainage lies. 14,000 acres of country I never patrolled and never entered. There is a new sector. Different number, different boundaries. Sector, different number, different boundaries, different coordinates entirely. And in its internal advisory field, in the flat, colorless phrasing I would know anywhere, there is a single line. Avoid unnecessary entry until personnel begin remembering the same map again. I opened the map attached to the file. I had never seen it. It shows a drainage I have never walked, in a corner of the forest I never worked, a trail running along an east bench, a creek crossing low, a stand of larch near the north gate. I went and got the box. I opened it for the first time in 20 years, and I took out my old field notebooks, the private ones, the ones I filled in the seasons after my walk, and I laid them beside the new map from the far corner of a forest I never entered. Every line I ever drew matches it. The bench, the crossing, the larch. I have been trying, since then, to understand what it means that the thing has moved to ground I never touched, and drawn there the exact forest I began to remember, and that my own hand, 20 years ago, was already mapping a place I would not be sent to for 2 more decades. I think it means the line was never around the sector. I think the sector was only ever the place we happened to be standing when it reached us. I think it has been in all of us who entered patiently the whole time, and that it has simply grown large enough now to need a bigger blank space, to hold the version of the forest we have all, without ever speaking, agreed to remember. So I will tell you the only thing I am sure of, and then I will close the box for good. If you are a ranger, and you are new, and a tired supervisor draws a clean line through one sector of your forest, and hands you a different route, and tells you that you'll understand, after your first season, take the route. Do not go and look. It will be beautiful in there, and calm, and better kept than anywhere else, and you will walk out unharmed, and nothing will happen to you at all. It will happen later. It will happen so gently, you will call it memory. And one day, long after you have left, someone will send you a map of a place you have never been, and you will recognize every line of it, because you drew it years ago, and you will finally understand that the blank stretches of forest the old rangers quietly steer you around are not empty. They are just waiting for the rest of us to remember them the same way.